So, if you've been on Twitter, specifically in the Christian/Mormon spaces recently, you might have heard of this guy by the name of Rich Tidwell. He is a Missouri pastor of a non-denominational Protestant church, and he recently announced that he has taken a second wife. So, yeah, good for him, I guess. So, of course, this has raised a bit of a stir. People are getting into debates over whether polygamy is biblical. This guy has been on a social media warpath telling everyone that it's perfectly biblical. And that's the debate I'm not really too interested in. Honestly, it seems like the objective answer is that the New Testament is pro-monogamy, while the Old Testament is flexible in regards to monogamy and polygamy. I think that's the real answer. So I think a Christian should just, go with what the New Testament clearly teaches and avoid polygamy. But that's not really my hill to die on. I don't feel too strongly about it. I think common sense more so just says stay away from polygamy. It's not the Bronze Age. There aren't really practical reasons to engage in polygamy. That's just my opinion. But that's not really what I want to focus on. I want to focus more on how it applies to the Mormon Church. So, with the debates going on about polygamy, whether it's biblical, of course, Mormons are getting involved in these debates naturally because, polygamy is unbiblical. That makes Mormons look bad, though I think almost a century of practicing polygamy looks worse than, not following the Bible in one specific way. But, if it could be argued to be biblical, then I guess that makes Mormons look a bit better. So, Mormon Twitter accounts have been getting into this debate, and like I said, I'm not really too worried about the actual debate, but I think a topic more interesting is how this topic kind of reflects on modern Mormonism, how, polygamy, modern practitioners of polygamy, like this pastor guy, like the fundamentalist Mormons, how that poses a challenge to modern Mormons, and really more like modern Mormonism and its legitimacy. So, you want to talk about the history of polygamy. Of course, the seminal thing to start with is Joseph Smith. His polygamy, I feel like, is kind of a weird situation where it doesn't really make sense. I talked about this in a previous video, but it's kind of a catch-22 where, it's argued by Mormons today that he didn't cohabitate with any of his wives, and he had something like 40 wives in secret. He didn't cohabitate with them, and some of them were like teenagers, like 14-year-old girls. So he didn't cohabitate with them, he didn't have children with them, he didn't have sex with them. It's a little hard to say that absolutely nothing sexual happened. I think that's more of a hope. But, he didn't have children, so at the very least, there clearly wasn't like prolonged, frequent, intercourse or whatever. But it's not really a perfect defense, because it's still weird to marry other people's wives and other people's children, and such a large number of them. Even if you truly believe that you're just going to have them in the next life, that's not a lot better. It's still a very weird situation. And there's also the problem that, it doesn't match the actual scriptures he produced. The scriptures he produced that talk about polygamy talk about it as a reproductive thing, raising up seed. So secretly marrying women and girls and neither cohabitating nor being intimate with them, while it looks better to us modern people for that to not have happened, it goes against the actual scriptures that he produced on the subject. So the whole thing with him is weird, but it's 132, which is the primary, scriptural basis for Mormon polygamy. Also kind of has a bit of a weird backstory where Joseph Smith, it's accredited to Joseph Smith, but he didn't publish it in his time. It was later published by Brigham Young, but I believe historians generally accept that it was from Joseph Smith. So the whole thing is kind of weird, but I guess I'm not trying to be a, polygamy denier, though I think that kind of terminology in any context is stupid. I think that's religious language, frankly, saying that someone's a denier, rather than just someone has a contrary opinion that goes against the mainstream or the general consensus. But that's an aside. I'm not really staking a hill on anything. I'm just stating that the whole Joseph Smith polygamy thing is weird. Not just in the sense that it's odd, but it doesn't all entirely make sense. But anyway, so that's not a rabbit hole to get into today. But so 132, it's all about the new and everlasting covenant. And there's kind of a there's a debate to be had whether 132 is saying that eternal marriage is the new and everlasting covenant, or that polygamous eternal marriage specifically is the new and everlasting covenant. I think the modern Mormon line is that eternal marriage is the new and everlasting covenant. But I think the text itself, I don't think it's entirely explicit. I think you can argue both points. It's only talking about one new and everlasting covenant, and it doesn't, at no point does the text say, eternal marriage is the new and everlasting covenant. For a time, we'll practice it polygamously, but then we'll give it up. But the key thing is the eternal marriage. The polygamy is just a flavor of the eternal marriage. It doesn't say that, but I don't think the text is explicit enough, for either argument to be invalid. I will say that, the early prophets and apostles and members, at least in general, definitely believed the new and everlasting covenant was polygamy, specifically. I guess I'm not a historian. I don't have as much knowledge of this time period as I wish I did, so I could have some detail or two wrong, but at the very least, prophets and apostles taught that the new and everlasting covenant was polygamous eternal marriage. This idea of it just being eternal marriage and polygamy just being a flavor of it or whatever was absolutely not a concept, before polygamy was abandoned by the LDS Church. So some seminal scriptures and teachings. So another significant one, Jacob 2:30, which basically, to summarize, basically after a long diatribe about how terrible polygamy is, that verse in the Book of Mormon says, well, it's generally interpreted to say, if I want my people to be polygamous, I'll command them to be polygamous. But if I don't command them, they won't be polygamous. It is kind of interesting that this verse was published before Joseph Smith became polygamous, and years before the church, practiced polygamy. So it kind of makes you wonder, did people interpret it that way when they received the Book of Mormon? Because the general interpretation is that it says that. There's a semantic argument to be made that it's not saying that, but, I think there's a safe reason that the general interpretation is that it's a loophole, so they say. So some significant teachings from Mormon prophets about this new and everlasting covenant of polygamy. So Brigham Young, this is from Journal of Discourses, volume 11, page 269. You can look this up to fact check me. So he said, the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. So, that is obviously borrowing language from 132, and I guess the only difference is that he's explicitly saying polygamy rather than just the new and everlasting covenant. So you could say that's his interpretation of 132, or you could say that's just what 132 says. I still think there's room for personal interpretation because I think the text is a bit vague. So another prophetic quote. So let's see, John Taylor, the third president of the church. Here's some quotes from him on this subject. And this is from the Journal of Discourse, volume 25, page 309, 310. So, God has given us a revelation in regard to celestial marriage. I did not make it. He has told us certain things pertaining to this matter, and they would like us to tone that principle down and change it and make it applicable to the views of the day. This we cannot do, nor can we interfere with any of the commands of God to meet the persuasions or behests of men. I cannot do it and will not do it. If God has introduced something for our glory and exaltation, we are not going to have that kicked over by any improper influence, either inside or outside of the church of the living God. We will stand by the principles of eternal truth. Living, we will proclaim them, and dying, we will be true to them. And after death, we will live again in their enjoyment of the eternal worlds. So, wow, that quote, that is honestly kind of shocking because, it's inarguable that the church has done exactly what he said it wouldn't do. Internal and external influences got the church to abandon that practice that was supposedly instituted by God. That's completely against what John Taylor said here. And frankly, it makes it sound like the entire church is in apostasy if John Taylor was a true prophet. And, that was a truly prophetic utterance. So another quote from a LDS prophet on this subject. So Joseph F. Smith, 6th president of the church. This is from Journal of Discourses, volume 20, page 28. Quote, sorry, not quote, but so in a bit more of a summary, using some of this specific language, Joseph F. Smith affirmed as prophet that sealed monogamous marriage is a fulfillment of the celestial law of marriage in part, but it is only the beginning of the law, not the whole of it, and that whoever has imagined that he could obtain the fullness of the blessings pertaining to this celestial law by complying with only a portion of its conditions has deceived himself. So again, he's echoing Brigham Young, he's echoing the other prophets. He's making it very clear it's not enough to be monogamously sealed for eternity, to reap the full blessings of exaltation and becoming a god, having eternal increase and whatnot. He's making it very clear you have to be polygamous. So another significant prophetic statement. This one is a bit more of a disputed, controversial citation. But so in 1886, Revelation by John Taylor on the topic of polygamy. So this one, for a very long time, the LDS Church disputed that this legitimately was stated by John Taylor. I think very recently they've acknowledged that this was from John Taylor. I think for a long time the fundamentalist Mormons used this statement as evidence that the church was never supposed to abandon polygamy, but for a long time it was disputed, but it's pretty uncontroversial now that this came from John Taylor. I think the main LDS defense right now is that it's an invalid prophetic utterance, or it's not canon, because he uttered it by himself and it wasn't approved by the whole Quorum of the 12 and everything. But I'll get into that in a bit. I don't think that's a great defense, but anyway, so that's just the background. I think this was in a letter to his son who was a fierce polygamist who I believe broke with the LDS Church to continue practicing polygamy. I'll link a video in the description that goes into more detail about this history from a historian. But so this is some of the quotes from this 1886 Revelation by John Taylor, which is specifically in the voice of God. So, if prophets, legitimately speak for God, and if they're legitimately speaking in the voice of God, I don't think that can just be dismissed as, something non-canon. I think that kind of invalidates the entire idea of a prophet, if you can just dismiss something they say, even if it's in the voice of God, for some reason. So anyway, enough rambling. This is the actual quotation. How can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. So he went on to affirm in this revelation that it is necessary for exaltation to enter into the new and everlasting covenant of polygamy. Quote, Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting. And those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so, amen. Close quote. So, like I said, there's disputations over how legitimate this is as something binding. The background is this was during the general period where a large amount of LDS leadership was underground. The saints were practicing polygamy illegally in secret. Some saints were fleeing to Canada or Mexico to practice polygamy. And, there was all this external pressure from the U.S. government. People were going to prison for polygamy. That might be a little bit later. I might have my timeline a little bit off. But there's just all this pressure around polygamy. And, Joseph Taylor, or John Taylor, sorry, the prophet here was saying unambiguously, this is an eternal commandment. We're never going to give this up. This is critical. So you have all this background. You have this clear continuity of prophets in the polygamous era affirming that polygamy is a central part of the new and everlasting covenant, basically is the new and everlasting covenant. And there's no concept that, you can strip away polygamy and the church can just monogamously practice healings and everything would be hunky-dory. They're very clearly stating that, this practice, eternal polygamous unions, is of God and must continue and is the way for exaltation to occur. So, of course, that raises the question, well, why do we stop doing it then? If God himself said that we have to do this, to become like him, then you think no hoop to jump through, no barrier would be too great to continue practicing this. And I think it's pretty obvious that the LDS Church stopped practicing polygamy because of pressure from the U.S. government. They wanted Utah to be a state. They wanted, the government to get off their backs. They wanted to avoid all this pressure. So they gave up polygamy. And, there was a few declarations. There was kind of a period of a few years where people were still being polygamous. People were still even, new polygamous sealings were even happening. It was still going on underground. It took a while, or it took a bit to really get clamped down. And then, of course, the fundamentalists sprang from this. And I have total sympathy for them because, they were, they believed, even living underground, fleeing from the law and everything, they believed they were, surmounting persecution to follow God. And their leaders told them that completely. And then their leaders just, once it became necessary, their leaders flipped the script. And all of a sudden, they were the apostates for doing what their leaders told them to do. So I'm completely sympathetic to those fundamentalist Mormons. I mean, I don't believe in polygamy, but, I think that's true, genuine faith to continue practicing such a dangerous lifestyle because you truly believed it was from God. I think that makes the rest of the church look bad and look like they're in apostasy. Prophets teach one thing. Many prophets teach one thing, a very clear practice, something they say is an everlasting principle to always be followed. And once it becomes inconvenient, the church abandons it. That just seems like apostasy. I don't know how you'd say that's anything other than apostasy. That's why this Pastor Tilwell guy, these fundamentalist Mormons, that's why they're a challenge to the LDS Church, because, the LDS Church dropped polygamy because it became inconvenient, because, the government was suppressing it. But in the 21st century, you can be polygamous. You clearly can. This Tilwell guy, he's just straight up being polygamous. These fundamentalists, there's tens of thousands of them, they're being polygamous. I believe it's technically illegal in Utah, but I believe it's been reduced to a misdemeanor rather than a straight up felony. But, if the reason it was taken away was because of this legal persecution, well, that's basically gone. So if these early prophets were telling the truth that this is a crucial thing from God, then we could go back to being polygamous. We have the resources. We have the power. The LDS Church is extremely rich, has huge amounts of influence in Utah. If they wanted to make polygamy happen again, they could. So I guess there's a few Mormon apologetic objections to some of the things I've said so far. So one of them, like I mentioned before, the Jacob 2:30, is basically almost like the idea of many dispensations, but when it comes to polygamy, which, I don't know, just thinking about it just like rationally and objectively, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It seems like a convenient explanation for the ongoing polygamy debate, because this is not a new debate at all. I think this is like centuries or millennia old. I think this is just kind of an explanation. Basically, in the Old Testament, that was a dispensation, more or less, where polygamy was okay, and the New Testament was not. Honestly, I think that's just a really lazy explanation. I think there's much better explanations. But, assuming this is all legitimate, that these scriptures are true and whatnot, I think the problem with that, though, is that the actual prophet, John Taylor, they all, the prophets before him, they affirmed polygamy as being of God and as being an ongoing eternal practice of the Latter-day Saints. And he even explicitly had a revelation where he made it completely clear that this was not going to go away. And for it to go away because of external pressure, you can't tell me that that's just God changing his mind about polygamy. That's obvious what happened. You'd have to bury your head in the sand and be obtuse to pretend that anything other than man caving to men is what happened there. I mean, isn't that men fearing man more than God? So on that basis alone, unless those early prophets were just totally in apostasy, it really seems like the LDS Church is in apostasy by their own definitions. A church that has revealed to them a practice that enables them to reach their highest potential and become like God, and for that church to abandon that practice, as soon as opposition comes their way, external opposition. I don't know how you could say that's anything other than apostasy by definition. God's supposed to be the supreme being, so I think God's church could probably have the strength to stand up to, a bit of legal persecution. You know, I mean, if it's more like people genuinely wanted polygamy to be done away with, other than maybe the polygamists, because polygamy is just not a great practice. I mean, that's understandable, but that's a different paradigm completely. So, some other objections. They're a common defense especially whenever Brigham Young, is brought up as having said something terrible, like something about how like race mixers should be killed, or how like black people are the cursed seed of Cain, or about blood atonement. A common apologetic defense is, well, he was just speaking as a man. He wasn't speaking as a prophet. Which, for one thing, that kind of completely invalidates the idea of a prophet. They don't have a flashing button that says, speaking as a prophet, speaking as a prophet. Like, we have no way of knowing when they're speaking as prophets. And if the standard was that we're to compare what they say to the scriptures to determine if they're speaking as prophets, maybe that would be one thing, but that's not the standard. If Dallin Oaks today gives a talk and introduces a new concept, by the rules of the game, the way Mormonism is set up, I can't say that's unscriptural, that's unbiblical, that's false. I don't have that authority, allegedly, because I'm not the prophet. So it really just ends up being where prophets speak as prophets until it turns out something they said later is controversial or has to be retconned or something like that, in which case it wasn't speaking as a prophet. And, maybe if there was like one or two of these statements, you could say they're just speaking as a prophet, but this is clear continuity. And there's also, I guess another defense they'll say is that, well, a statement has to be completely endorsed and officially, or published by the entire quorum, the whole Q15 for it to be legitimate, which I don't think that's a real standard. I mean, that's not a standard that's remotely upheld in any of the scriptures, I mean, the Book of Mormon, Moroni at the end is literally like the only Nephite left, and he's compiling the Book of Mormon. He's adding to it. He's not, passing things by his quorum of apostles. And again, if that's the standard we're going with, then most things apostles have said can be dismissed and ignored. Like, for two centuries of prophetic and apostolic teachings and statements can just be completely ignored, because apparently we can't trust anything that wasn't officially stamped by and promoted by the entire church. And even then, I think they have, basically done that in instances where we've still gone back on it. I think they had like a manifesto about the racial ban, I think. And of course, the ideas in that ban are now condemned by the church. So, it's just a nonsense standard that they don't stick to. And an example of this is, so when I was researching the Heavenly Mother video I made, check that out. So one of the things that was cited was a statement by M. Russell Ballard in an address where he mentioned that the plan of salvation was given to us not just by Heavenly Father, but also by Heavenly Mother. Now, that wasn't based on any specific scripture. He wasn't even a prophet, he was just an apostle. It wasn't officially published and approved by the entire Q15. He was just giving an address and he said that, and now it's doctrine. Now, if that's the standard for how prophets and apostles work, that would generally make sense, but that's clearly not a universal standard. He was just an apostle, just speaking as giving an address, and he said something about Heavenly Mother, and now it's considered canon or doctrine or part of the tiny amount of truth we've had revealed about Heavenly Mother. So, like I'm saying, these aren't consistent standards that have been applied across the church. They're just bad apologetics. I'm not sure what else you could call it. So yeah, I think that's basically where we stand, multiple prophets, as the entire period in which polygamy was practiced, prophets affirmed, and apostles, at the very least tacitly endorsed. I think Brigham Young had a few things he said that some of his apostles, kind of publicly argued against. So that's a legitimate instance where you can say that, you can talk about having to have, apostolic unity for it to be doctrine. If you want to talk about an instance where the apostles are actually publicly arguing against something he said, or at least one or two of them are, that's something. But, that wasn't like consistently happening throughout this period. It wasn't like rogue prophets, against apostles. Like, there was clearly prophetic and apostolic unity on this topic. And they very clearly taught that polygamy is not just a temporary lifestyle, but was to be an eternal, everlasting covenant, the only means through which, men and women can be exalted and become gods. So for such a crucial thing, and for the LDS Church, upon facing pressure to completely abandon the practice and, excommunicate those who continued the practice, even though those people were told to continue it, even, after the first declaration and everything. So, I think it paints the LDS Church as being in apostasy by their own standards completely. And if you argue against that, then you also seriously diminish the authority and value of prophets if they can be so horribly wrong for so long. And this pastor guy, these fundamentalists, it raises a serious challenge. They're polygamists in 2025. Why aren't the Mormons polygamous? It's legally possible. They have the resources to fight these court battles. The LDS Church has so much money, wealth, influence. Like, if they wanted to fight for polygamy, they could. But obviously they don't want to bring it back. Polygamy sucks. Nobody sane wants to bring it back. This pastor guy is crazy for instituting it in his own family. I'm sure there's some kind of nefarious reason for that. And I don't know, it really makes you want... how many Mormons today would celebrate if polygamy was brought back? None of them would. You ask Mormons about it, and the defense will be like, well, it was a real trial, especially for the women, or, it was such a test of faith. But I don't know, if it's revealed truth from God that's necessary for exaltation, shouldn't that be a joyous thing? I don't know. I don't think the good news of the gospel should fill people with horror and dread like polygamy clearly has, throughout its entire history. So it's a serious challenge to the church because, looking at this, this pastor guy, Mormons can't say, oh man, that guy sucks, he's a polygamist. They'd be, in some cases, just straight up defaming their ancestors. They'd be defaming their previous prophets. They'd be defaming God because God is either polygamist or pro-polygamy in Mormonism. And so all they can really argue is, well, it's biblical, but you got to have the proper authority, which isn't really an argument. I don't know. That's what Mormons have to say about baptism for the past, 2 millennia, where, they were trying to do the right thing, but they didn't have the right authority. I don't think Mormons would outright say that about this pastor guy, but, you're very limited in your ethical objections when you have that history. And I think the same goes for Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs, he's considered the prophet of the fundamentalist LDS Church. He's in prison right now for child sex abuse. And his cult, it's a straight up cult. They do all sorts of horrible things, like the prophet totally controls access to wives and property. If you get on his bad side, he can just completely take away your wives, take away your property, give it to other people, give it to himself. It's a truly horrific cult, but, and this, I think he inherited, most of his father's wives. His father, I think, was Rulon. So, actually, no, I think Warren Jeffs is the current one. Rulon is the previous one. So, Mormons, they're very limited in their objections to Warren Jeffs. They can't, what can you say? 70 wives is morally wrong. Well, Brigham Young had, 50 wives. Maybe you can think, oh, he got a little bit excessive with it, but of course Mormons have to endorse David from the Bible, who was said to have 500 wives. So it's a morally compromising thing. I guess it doesn't come up too much, so it's not like it's causing Mormons across the board to be immoral or whatever. But it just shows kind of the issue with Mormon ethics, where it compromises you, where you can't look at Warren Jeffs and say that's wrong. You can say that it was gone about in a wrong way, that maybe he had a bit too many wives, but you really can't even say that because of Brigham Young and because of King David. So it's a real compromise, and the whole thing challenges Mormonism on multiple levels. It challenges the legitimacy of its prophets. It challenges the legitimacy of the current church, and suggests that by their own standards they're in apostasy. And it challenges Mormon ethics, because it is kind of a fundamental idea in Mormon ethics that if God says it's okay no matter what, whether it's beheading, whether it's marrying children, whether it's being polygamous and having dozens of wives or even hundreds of wives. And I don't know, I mean, Mormons are generally good ethical people. I'm not trying to suggest that Mormons are across the board ethically compromised, but I think it's a real flaw in the Mormon ethical system, and I just think it's an overall challenge. Because on what grounds can you condemn this pastor guy? Because he didn't have the right eternal permit. He didn't have, God didn't approve of. Well, God. I mean, what can you even say? God approves of polygamy, but he doesn't approve of polygamy right now because the U.S. government tried to stamp out polygamy. So that made God change his mind, and that means that this pastor guy, if he had done this a century or so ago, would have been in the clear. But since he's doing it currently, you can't even say it's wrong. You can only just say it's, not currently endorsed by God, but could be endorsed by God in the future. You can't even morally object to that. It's compromise. It's a genuine compromise of ethics. So yeah, that's what I think. Let me know if you have any corrections, if you think anything I said was factually inaccurate or anything to that nature. And yeah, thank you for watching. Have a good one. Goodbye.